had been excluded from the mainstream of Canadian life for far too long and faced very high barriers to public participation because of their language. This seems somewhat quaint today, but back in the day when Canada was a much whiter country than it is now, the rights of the French Canadian minority was considered like the big social justice issue of its time. Quebec was a much poorer place than the rest of Canada, and the French Canadians were considered almost like a sort of underclass. Someone of like my grandmother's generation would have grown up thinking of the French Canadians as these very poor, backwards people that worked all of the worst sorts of jobs, partially because they were less educated, but also partially because they were so bad at English no one wanted to hire them. There's even this very famous book about French Canadians from the 1960s that compares them to like the African Americans in the US. It is called the, well, I'm just gonna hold my finger over part of the word here, but you can probably tell what's going on. So yes, that was certainly how a lot of the French Canadians thought of themselves, and how a lot of English Canadians would have thought of them. Anyway, in 1968, the Canadian government passed official bilingualism in order to make it easier for the French Canadians to communicate with their government and get access to government services and so on.
Well, I'm quite sure that it will have a solidifying effect on Canadian unity. From the French-Canadian side, they will have been given the first concrete proof that Canada and Canadians are just not a host of good intentions, but that we really mean to get down to business when we talk about the two official languages. The statute will provide equality of the two languages in all areas where the citizens of Canada have to communicate with the government, with Parliament, so that any citizen of Canada will be able to use the official language of his choice.
Today, Ottawa provides every government form and website in French as well as English. There are also lots of French-speaking call centers and French-speaking clerks at government offices and all this sort of thing. I think a lot of English Canadians would argue that this is a perfectly fair and reasonable way for the government of Canada to interact with French-speaking communities. However, what is decidedly not reasonable and fair is what has mutated out of this in the decades since 1968, which is to say the rise of a French-speaking elite. This was actually something that Canada's Conservative Party warned about at the time.
Indicated our party will support the resolution, but we've asked that the problems of the unilingual Canadians in the government service be kept in mind, and we also cautioned the government against creating a new injustice by not considering adequately in the administration of the Act the fact that French is rather difficult to learn in most English-speaking parts of the country.
Alright, so this is basically the crux of the problem. Once the Canadian government commits to providing lots of French language services, the Canadian government has to hire lots of French-speaking bureaucrats to run all of the French language services. And then, as the Canadian government grows larger and larger and starts providing more and more services, Ottawa needs to hire even more French language bureaucrats and give them even more power. This includes making all of the senior managers of the government bilingual in order for them to be able to manage all of the bilingual bureaucrats below them. And then you get people arguing that the politicians themselves should also be bilingual, because, of course, it is the role of the politicians to manage the bureaucracy. And this is basically where we are in Canada today. Overall, 43% of all bureaucratic jobs in the Canadian federal government now require the employee to be bilingual. And remember, only 18% of Canadians are bilingual. The bilingual requirements, in turn, get stricter and stricter the higher up the ladder you go. To be head of a bureaucratic department, or to be head of anything important in, like, the judiciary, or the military, or like the finance department, bilingualism is mandatory. And of course, to be a top politician, like prime minister or a senior cabinet minister, bilingualism is required as well. This is all very excessive. It is really quite absurd, in fact, to argue that in order to service the needs of the 11.9% of Canadians who can only speak French, it is somehow necessary for every single figure of importance in the Canadian federal government to be fluent in French. I mean, there are such things as translators. So if this system is so ridiculous, why do we keep it? Basically because it is in the interests of two groups of people in Canadian society that we do keep it. One is the Quebecers, who have gone from being some of the least important people in Canada to the most important people in Canada in a very short period of time. Since Quebecers are the group of Canadians who are most likely to be bilingual, they will naturally benefit disproportionately from any political system that is based around favoring bilingualism. The government currently estimates that 32% of all senior rank bureaucrats in the Canadian federal government are native French speakers. And considering that 85% of all native French speakers are also Quebecers, you can see how they would make out well in this arrangement. The other group that has benefited enormously from this political setup is the small minority of French-speaking Canadians in other provinces. This is mostly Quebec migrants and their offspring who have moved to other Canadian provinces over the years. It also includes children of certain upper middle class English Canadian families who have had access to the sort of resources to get their children a high-quality French education at a young age. But in general, it is worth remembering that most people only become fluent in a language that they have some day-to-day need for. If you do not come from a situation where French is an active part of the culture of your day-to-day life, it is unlikely that you will become fluent in French. This becomes very clear when we look at the rates of French fluency in provinces other than Quebec. After Quebec, the largest number of French-speaking Canadians can be found in New Brunswick, which is a small province of about 700,000 people that borders Quebec. It has a large French-Canadian population for historic reasons and a bilingualism rate of 33.9%. But let's look at some of the bigger provinces, which are the product of very different history and geography. In Ontario, the French-English bilingualism rate is 11.6%. In my province of British Columbia, the rate is 6.8%, and in Alberta, the rate is 6.6%. So as you can see, when we are talking about French-speaking Canadians outside of Quebec, we are talking about a very small community of people. And also, remember that these statistics are entirely self-reported. I mean, I'm sure you know that not everybody that claims to be able to speak a second language actually can. The small communities of French-speaking Canadians outside of Quebec, however, are savvy enough to know a good thing when they see it. They know that they will continue to enjoy a great deal of power and influence in Canada, so long as the country continues to uphold this whole bilingualism scheme. This is why they naturally get very defensive when politicians like Premier Ford argue for cuts to bilingualism in the name of money or numbers.
More than 5,000 demonstrators flooding the streets of Ottawa, angry at the Ford government cutting French language services in Ontario, including a long-proposed French language university. Feeling their distinct way of life is under attack.
But, you know, I mean, I do not want to suggest that these people are completely cynical. They probably do genuinely believe that bilingualism is an important part of Canadian culture, and that it is morally right for bilingual people to hold all of these top government jobs. But the fact is, when you have an unequal distribution of power in a society that favors one group of people over another, the favored group of people will inevitably come up with a theory to rationalize their own privilege. In Canada's case, this theory takes the form of a patriotic fable that Canada is, like, at its essence, at its core, a marriage between French and English people. This is sometimes called the two founding nations theory. And they push it through all sorts of government propaganda and traditions. For instance, on the Canadian coat of arms, you see that they have the English flag and the French flag, the two founding nations. And then, like, symbolic jobs like the Governor General always rotate between French Canadians and English Canadians. Now, in the 18th century, when Canada was just a small chunk of land in eastern North America, comprising a few English and French colonial settlements, yes, you could argue that the two founding nations theory made some sense, but certainly it makes a lot less sense these days when Canada has grown into this enormous country with all these new provinces, most of which have no history of French colonialism at all. And of course, today Canada is this very multicultural country with people from all over the world. For instance, the number of Canadians who do not speak French or English as their first language now totals 7.7 million people, or 22.3% of the national population. That is already higher than the 7.4 million Canadians who speak French as their first language. And unless the French Canadians really start breeding up a storm, they are just going to continue to be a smaller and smaller minority. In fact, I would say that one of the great ticking time bombs is just how undemocratic this reality is going to make Canada in the future. What's going to happen, in fact, what's already happening, is that you're going to have this very big, diverse country in which power is concentrated in the hands of a smaller and smaller linguistic elite with higher and higher barriers to entry. I mean, the ironic thing is that this is exactly the same situation that the French Canadians were protesting way back when. The idea of a society stratified by language in which a privileged group at the top uses their control of the state to discriminate against everyone not like them. So, am I right or wrong about this? I want you guys to let me know in the comments. And let me know if this situation in Canada reminds you of a situation anywhere else in the world. Alright, so now let us lighten the mood by doing some viewer mail. Today's mail comes from my friend Darius, or Doris. He is from Bosnia and Herzegovina, so he has given me a couple of interesting things. He has given me this cool little wooden pyramid, which he says is based on a pyramid-shaped mountain that is quite popular and can be entered. People make jokes about the Bosnian pharaohs, he says. That's pretty cool. He has also given me 2 Bosnian tourism magazines, a CD of traditional Bosnian music. He got me this little purse that has the mascot from the 1984 Sarajevo Olympic Games. It was an Olympics that took place in the year I was born. So